at the office, just to let you
Sure.
know. All
So
right.
what we're doing is, and I'll tell everybody, we're going to, except for the people that are speaking, we're going to have everybody mute, so we don't have. It's difficult. You got phones ringing, you got dogs barking, and dishwashers running and stuff. So, but anyhow, I'll go over that in a second. So I think I'm going to jump in. Is Jeremy online with us yet, or he's probably going to come in a little while, I suppose. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. Yes.
I am here. Sorry, I was on mute. So.
Okay. No, that's great. That's great. Thank you, Jeremy.
No problem.
You and Gabe both really appreciate your help today. So I'm just going to go ahead and start, and we'll get into it. So let me get to my screen here. See if this will work. So hopefully everyone online can hear and can see adequately. Welcome everyone. I really appreciate your taking your time to come to our annual training. Typically, I do some type of, presentation, or one of us, maybe sometimes Paul Shreddy has done a few presentations. This year, though, we actually have real presenters with some real information for you. NJDEP has adopted rules and BMPs for green infrastructure. You may have heard that term before. You're going to learn a lot about it today. We have Gabe Mon and Jeremy Lang. Gabe is from DEP. Jeremy is from, I forget, I got it. Let me get into it. So we're talking about guest speakers. Please mute yourself while we're doing our presentation so we don't hear background noise. Our guest speakers are going to speak. We'd like you to hold your questions until the end. There's a chat that is available on the lower right-hand side of your screen, or should be, and you can pose your questions there. After they're done speaking, I want to discuss a little bit on my thoughts on green infrastructure and the standards and what that might mean to us. And then we'll do the Q&A via the chat. And so I'll try to, pose the questions, and I believe Jeremy and Gabe can also see them. And then we'll basically be done when I get tired of asking these guys what-if questions. Just so Gabe and Jeremy know, if they don't already, our guys are the world-famous world record holders for what-if scenarios, and they're very, very good at it. So at any rate, that's kind of the format that we'd like to do. And again, without further ado, I'm just going to give you guys both at the same time. I'm going to go through each bio just real quick. Most people know who you are. This is somewhat perfunctory, but it's because we do what we do. Our speakers, Gabe Mon is from DEP. He's got a BS in chemical engineering, and he has previously worked for land use regulation. You guys, my guys, DEP, the district guys know land use a lot. And he's dealt a lot with the flood hazard area, coastal zone management, freshwater wetlands, all that stuff. But for the last couple of years, he's actually been the bureau chief at what I used to call the Bureau of Non-Point Source Pollution Control, but I guess they call it BNPC now. So he's chief over there. And you can see in the highlighted areas, I'm not going to read that stuff to you, but he's got a lot of programs under his belt, including stuff that deals with stormwater, which is kind of where we come in. And so Gabe is kind of our go-to guy when we have to deal with stormwater rules and flood hazard stuff and things like that. Although sometimes I talk to Vince Mazai as well over there. But anyhow, you see Gabe's email at the bottom, his contact for you. Next, we have Jeremy Lang, and Jeremy is a private consultant, absolutely no stranger to our program. He was very instrumental in helping us work out the soil compaction standard, as well as other standards been on the engineering half of our training committees. Jeremy has a lot of acronyms after his name, including a PE. Active acquisitions. That's it. I couldn't think of the active part. That's a recent post. Jeremy has been working for Maser Consulting. You may have run into him there, and he is still doing consulting for Maser. He has got a lot of years, over 2 decades, close to 3 decades of experience in stormwater management, and the stuff I highlighted in yellow is the important stuff, which is almost all of his bio really. But he's a member of pretty much every society and group that's affiliated with development or engineering in the state of New Jersey. He's also a licensed professional engineer and PP, professional planner. And then he goes on to explain what those other acronyms stand for and mean. The big takeaway, though, in his bio is that he's an expert witness, engineering expert witness. Not many people are. That is really a feather in the cap to have that as part of your bio. And you see Jeremy's email contact information down below. So those are our two speakers. Gabe always wins the coin toss, and he is going to start with a review and description, discussion, and examination of the rule aspects of green infrastructure, so you guys get the basis and background. And then once he's wrapped up, Jeremy is going to actually give us a presentation on his experiences, and he's done projects with green infrastructure. So he's got very much the pragmatic view of this technology and this approach to stormwater management. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Gabe. And Gabe, I think, can you just command your machine to take over? Or do I need to stop sharing? Well, it looks like you may have it.
You got it? You see it?
I see it coming up. Boom, got it.
All right. So, John, thanks for the introduction. As John said, my name is Gabriel Mann. I'm the Bureau Chief of the Bureau of Non-Point Pollution Control with the DEP. And today I'm going to talk about our stormwater management rule amendments that relate to green infrastructure. I have this slide on here, though. I think probably most of you are aware of the differences here. But we're going to be talking about post-construction, right? We're talking about the stormwater management rules. It only really deals with post-construction stormwater management, as opposed to construction stormwater management, which I'm sure you're quite familiar with the rules that implement those requirements. There's really two ways, though, that you're going to get a review for post-construction stormwater management in New Jersey, in these two main ways. And one is if you need a permit from the department, and that would be from the Division of Land Use Regulation. And you might not be aware of this right now, but the department's undergoing a bit of a reorganization, and the Division of Land Use Regulations name is going to change, I believe. But I still call it that, and I assume you will for a while too. And if you need a permit there, that would be like a flood hazard permit or a freshwater wetlands permit or even like a CAFR permit, then you're going to get direct review by the NJDEP, because if it's also a major development, all of those rule sets require the project to meet the stormwater management rules, and then it gets a review by the DEP staff. The other way, and actually something like 75% of the applications that happen in the state only get a review the second way, and that is through a municipality's MS4 permit. So every municipality that has a storm sewer system discharges into either surface water or groundwater of the state. They have a permit from our office called an MS4 permit, a municipal separate storm sewer system permit. And that permit allows their storm sewer system to discharge their pollutants into the rivers. And believe me, if you're not familiar, there's many requirements under those permits, but one of the main requirements is that they have to have a program at the municipal level to implement the stormwater management rules for major developments. And that happens two ways. One is through the RSIS. So if it's a residential project, whenever they're getting a planning board approval, they're going to have to make sure that it meets the RSIS. And the RSIS says you need to meet the stormwater management rules. The other way is if it's non-residential, the municipality has to create a stormwater control ordinance and adopt and enforce that. And that stormwater control ordinance needs to be as stringent as the stormwater management rules, though it could be more stringent. So this is where I think our setup in the state can be a little confusing at times, because a municipality can set up a more stringent requirement, but that more stringent requirement in all likelihood only applies to non-residential projects, because for the most part, RSIS is the minimum and maximum, although it does allow you to have a more stringent standard for quantity control, I believe, but it's pretty clear that you can't really do that for most other standards. And so we're mainly going to be focusing on the amendments that we recently adopted to the stormwater management rules. This is the schedule of how we got where we are. December 3rd, 2018, we proposed these amendments. There was a public hearing in January of 2019. The public comment period closed at the beginning of February of 2019. And then we spent the next, 8 months putting together responses to all those comments we received, and we filed for adoption on December 3rd, 2019. For any of you familiar with the rule process, you can see that was exactly a year after we proposed it, because that is the deadline by which you have to adopt a rule package unless you repropose it. So we just made the deadline, in fact, I think by just about an hour or two. And a couple important points of these rules is that, one, they came with a delayed operative date, which is why they're not already in effect, right? They came with a 1-year delayed operative date, so they won't become operative until March 2nd of 2021, which is a year after they were actually published in the New Jersey Register. So for right now, the current rules are still in effect, the old rules, the unamended rules. There's a couple reasons why we did that, but the two main reasons are, one, as you know, stormwater management designs can be rather complicated, and people spend a lot of time and money putting them together. So having the rules change on a dime is really unfair to a lot of people that had designs that are very far along in the process. So that 1-year delayed operative date allowed a lot of people to finish out those designs and give them and give them forefront knowledge that these rules are going to be effective in a year. So make sure if you're not going to be ready in that time, you're looking to the new rules and not the old rules. And at the same time, as I already mentioned, part of the implementation of the overall rules is that a municipality has to have a stormwater control ordinance. So when we amend the rules, it doesn't automatically amend their ordinances. The municipalities have to actually go back and they have to amend their own ordinances. And our MS4 permit already sets up a time frame for municipalities to be able to do this under any circumstance, even if it's just, we noticed your ordinance isn't good and you need to fix it. They do have a year to fix it after we notify them that their ordinance is no longer any good. So that year was already set forth, and we wanted to sort of line up when we're going to start reviewing it at the state level versus when it's going to happen at the municipal level. Of course, we can't guarantee the municipality will adopt their ordinance exactly on March 2nd of 2021, but having that 1-year delayed operative date will at least minimize the amount of applications that are going to be reviewed at significantly different standards at the different levels if you need both permits. Next thing I want to cover is what projects have to comply. I think you're probably all familiar with the term major development. And what we're looking at here on the screen is the amended definition of major development under those rules. Now, there's not sweeping changes to the definition of major development, but there's some important things that we were doing through frequently asked questions and some changes as a result of these amendments that we incorporated into the definition of major development. First thing I want to cover is the intro statement. So now it says that it means an individual development as well as multiple developments that individually or collectively result in the following. Now, in my opinion, that's mainly clarification of our own practices in the past, although it was never very clear before. The rule did say that you needed to count the ultimate disturbance and ultimate impervious surface on a site, but it wasn't clear exactly what that meant. Our frequently asked questions did try to clarify it and make sure that you couldn't break projects up into smaller projects to avoid regulation that way. And so we're just trying to clarify it here to make it very clear that if it's one development or multiple developments, whatever it is, if it totals up to one of these, it's major development. And the other main things that we've done is we've added timeframes to a lot of the various items here. So the first one is the disturbance of 1 or more acres of land, and that's unchanged, but we've tied it to February 2nd, 2004, because when you're thinking about ultimate disturbance, that question definitely came up many times. Well, are we counting disturbances that happened in 1990? Are we counting something that happened there in 1945? No, we're not. We're only counting things that are post-2004. Basically, that's tying back to when the rules in their current form were pretty much adopted. That was February 2nd, 2004. The next thing is the creation of 1/4 acre or more of regulated impervious surface since February 2nd, 2004. So there's two changes here. We've added February 2nd, 2004 again, and for the same reason above. That's when the 1/4 acre became part of the rule. It's February 2nd, 2004, so we're tying it to that time frame. The other change here is we added the word regulated impervious surface. Now, I'm going to cover that a little bit later in another slide, but you should just be aware that regulated impervious surface, that's why it's in quotes, is it's a defined term in the rules now. It has specific meaning. It's not only just new impervious surface. Next thing we've done, and this will tie to some changes we made to the water quality standard that I will cover later, is to add another item here that's the creation of 1/4 acre or more of regulated motor vehicle surface. And since this is something we're adding to the rules now, it's tied to March 2nd, 2021, rather than being tied back to 2004 like the rest. The other thing that we have is that you could do a combination of 2 and 3, and if that together totals more than 1/4 acre, it's also considered a major development. There's one caveat here is that you would never count the same surface twice when determining this. So you can envision a scenario, someone constructs 1/8 of an acre of a parking lot, an asphalt parking lot, right? So that would be impervious surface, and that would be motor vehicle surface because it's a parking lot. Motor vehicles are going to drive on it. It's 1/8 of an acre, but you wouldn't count it as 1/8 of an acre each, totaling 1/4 acre, making it a major development. The same surface only gets counted once, so that's only 1/8 of an acre. And assuming that wasn't associated with any other project, that would not be a major development. Now, the other thing that I want to cover here, and another confusing aspect of the stormwater program in New Jersey, is that the definition of major development is not necessarily the same at the municipal level. First of all, if it's through RSIS, it's definitely not the same, because RSIS's current definition is just ultimate disturbance of 1 acre or more. RSIS doesn't even include the 1/4 acre to begin with, and they haven't adopted our changes yet. Now, I have been involved in a couple conversations with them, and my understanding is that they are planning to amend the RSIS to use our definition, but I haven't seen a proposal that would actually be a rule proposal for them, and I haven't seen anything come out yet. So I can't say for sure they're going to do that, but in the discussions we had, that seemed to be what they were planning to do. The other thing is that, like I said, a municipality has to adopt a stormwater control ordinance. And when they're doing that, they have the opportunity to edit the definition of major development. First of all, our rules allow a municipality to have only the acre of disturbance. And we did that back in 2004 because that was the federal minimum standard. There has been some discussion about changing that in some of our stakeholdering, so we'll see what happens there. But for now, they only have to have the acre of disturbance. But many municipalities have the 1/4 acre voluntarily, and many municipalities also have more stringent standards because they decided an acre perhaps is too large since they're mostly 1/4 acre lots in their municipality, and so very few things are over an acre. So there are municipalities that I've seen that have definitions of major development that go down as low as, say, like 5,000 square feet of disturbance. So if you were ever wondering if something's a major development, it's easy to look at the stormwater management rules and see whether or not the state would consider it a major development, but it's going to get reviewed by the municipality. You do have to also look at the municipal stormwater control ordinance and see what it says there. Okay, next thing I want to cover is the layout of the rules and how we changed it. I'm only really going to talk about subchapter 5. That's our design and performance standards. That's really the meat of what someone's generally looking at in our rules. And this is what the existing subchapter 5 looks like. So we've got the scope, we've got the stormwater management measures for major development, which is a bunch of generic items in there that really apply to all major developments. Then we've got non-structural strategies. Then 5.4 is erosion control, groundwater recharge, and runoff quantity all together in the same section. 5.5 is quality. 5.6 is how you do your calculations. 5.7 is the standards for structural measures. 5.8 is maintenance, and then 5.9 is sources for technical guidance. And these are the edits that we're making. So first of all, one of the major changes that we're making to the rules in general is replacing the non-structural strategies with the requirement to use green infrastructure. Now, the non-structural stormwater management strategies aren't being completely deleted from the rules. They're being moved from the subchapter 5, the items that you would review directly against a development project, to being moved into the municipal planning requirements, where it's more considered in the municipal plan as they put things together. Because a lot of the non-structural strategies are preserving areas, not so much items for actually managing stormwater, but they do fit well into a municipal planning effort where they could decide, well, we don't want development in this section, we want to encourage over here, so we're going to, we're going to preserve some of this area over here. That's where a lot of the non-structural strategies, anyway, maybe not all of them, but a lot of them belong there. And that's where we move them. The other thing that we've done is we've taken a look at 5.2 and 5.7, which both were really generic items that applied to all major developments. And we decided there was no real reason to keep 5.7, which was structural stormwater management measures, distinctly separate from 5.2. So we combined them together. So 5.2 now is significantly longer because of that, but it really is just all generic items that apply to everything. 5.7 had things like what's the spacing on your trash rack, what's the minimum orifice size for a basin. No real reason it needed its own section in the rules. And what that did for us is it freed up a section. So 5.7 was at that time blank. And what we did was we moved 5.6 down into there. And then we were able to move runoff quantity down into 5.6. And erosion control, we moved up into 5.2 as well. I'm not sure if you're familiar with exactly what the stormwater management rules say on that, but it's really not a standard itself in our rules. It just says meet the soil erosion and sediment control standards. So we also felt like it didn't require its own section. We moved that up into the items that apply to everything, into 5.2. And so this is what the layout turns into. We have the scope, and we have the much expanded stormwater management measures for major development. We have green infrastructure, groundwater charge, stormwater runoff quality, stormwater runoff quantity. You've got your calculations and your maintenance and your sources for technical guidance. So what I think this has done is it's simplified the rule structure, and it's made the most important points of the rule structure, 5.3, 5.4, 5.5, 5.6, given each of them their own section, which I think and I hope it makes it more clear to everyone, and I think clarity leads to better designs and better applications overall. So I think it should be helpful in that regard. Next thing I want to cover is the definition of green infrastructure under our rules. So this is the definitions, cut and paste straight from the rule. Green infrastructure means a stormwater management measure that manages stormwater close to its source by treating stormwater runoff through infiltration into the subsoil, treating stormwater runoff through filtration by vegetation or soil, and storing stormwater runoff for reuse. So a question that I've often got, and now when I give this presentation, I try to answer it up front, is why doesn't this say anything about evapotranspiration? And you're right, it doesn't say anything about evapotranspiration. But there's really one reason for that, I guess, and that is that in the design of a stormwater management basin, we don't really take evapotranspiration into account. When you're designing something for the 100-year storm, the amount of evapotranspiration that you get in the maybe 72 hours at most that water is in a stormwater management basin is really largely irrelevant to the sizing of the basin. So it's not something we account for in the calculations. And at the same time, well, when you're talking about a BMP that relies on evapotranspiration, well, what is it? It's going to fall into one of these categories already. It's probably going to be number 2. It's going to be, say, a bioretention basin or something like that, and that's going to treat stormwater runoff through filtration by vegetation or soil. In fact, to have evapotranspiration, you've got to have vegetation there, and so it's probably going to fall into number 2. So even though we don't specifically call it out, those BMPs are covered by this definition. Oh, and one last thing to make sure you noticed here is that it says that it needs to manage stormwater close to its source. And I'll get into how we do that in the next slide, but that is an important caveat. So the green infrastructure standard is relatively straightforward. It requires you to use green infrastructure BMPs to satisfy the recharge, quantity, and quality standards. Small scale, which means limited drainage area BMPs, have to be used for recharge and quality. And that's where we get to the managing stormwater runoff close to its source. There was no way for us to mandate directly that your BMP be within 1,000 feet of where the rainfall hits. We thought about all sorts of ideas, but there was really no way to structure it that could work. So we decided that limiting the drainage area was the best way to go. So if you have a small drainage area, it's going to make you have multiple BMPs for recharge and quality rather than having, say, one BMP that treats a 50-acre site. You can't do that anymore under this. You'll have to have several BMPs to do the water quality and the recharge for that. Now, you can have a larger BMP for quantity control. That's still fine. It does need to be green infrastructure still, but you can use one without a limited drainage area. We've also created 3 tables in the rules that identify all the BMPs and the performance of each one. And those are labeled as Table 5.1, Table 5.2, Table 5.3. Table 5.1 covers the BMPs that are green infrastructure and small scale. So those are going to be able to be used for recharge, quality, or quantity. Table 5.2 is green infrastructure BMPs that are large scale, and those you're going to be able to use, in addition, you can use those for quantity control if you need them. And then Table 5.3 is the BMPs that we don't consider to be green infrastructure. And that table still does appear in the rules because there are some ways you could get there. Either a variance at the municipal level that allows you to do that, or perhaps a waiver of strict compliance for a roadway project could enable you to get to a non-green infrastructure BMP. We also retained in the rules, and I think clarified a bit, the ability for someone to propose an alternative BMP. So you could think of the BMP manual as department approved designs. Anyone can propose a design that's not department approved, The problem there is just that it becomes the designer's responsibility then to prove to the review agency that that BMP is going to provide the necessary treatment or the necessary quantity control or whatever it is, and to decide how much maintenance it needs, and they have to convince the review agency that all that is correct. So it's much simpler to choose a BMP we've already designed and approved, because then the designer doesn't have to answer any of those questions. But that option exists. I'm going to go through the tables now. So this is table 5.1. These are BMPs that you can use for recharge quality and quantity. These are the small scale green infrastructure BMPs. You've got cisterns, dry wells, grass swales, green roofs, MTDs. Now, that might seem surprising a bit, but there are several MTDs that we've now certified as green infrastructure. If you want to look at the list, you can go on our website at njstormwater.org, and you can go to the BMP or the MTD page there, and you've now broken the table out into two separate tables, one that shows which are green infrastructure and the one that shows which are not. But basically, the BMPs that we've approved so far that are green infrastructure are pretty much all some form of a small scale bioretention system that comes like in a concrete vault. We are starting to see some innovation here, which is good to see, and something we hoped we would see when we made these changes. So people are now looking at trying to do some MTDs that can provide some sort of infiltration, getting a little more creative. There's a constructed wetland type MTD that someone is just coming through with. It hasn't made it to my desk yet, but it's with NJAC at this point, who verifies the functionality before we do the certification of them. So there are going to be some more creative MTDs coming down the lines, and some of them may be green infrastructure. Also, we've got pervious paving systems, bioretention systems, infiltration basins, and sand filters, all of which need to be small scale. Right? Remember, these are the small scale BMPs, so they have to be small scale, and then vegetative filter strips. Now, I mentioned previously that the way we're getting small scale is by using a drainage area limitation. And so a drainage area limitation does apply to dry wells, to MTDs, to pervious paving systems, and to small scale bioretention, infiltration, and sand filters. It's not the same for every one of them. Dry wells have a 1 acre drainage area limit to remain small scale. MTDs have MTDs as well as small scale bioretention, infiltration, and sand filters all have a 2.5 acre drainage area limit. And then pervious paving systems has a different type of drainage area limit. It's a 3-to-1 ratio. So if you have 1,000 square feet of pervious paving, you can have 3,000 square feet of regular impervious paving drain onto that, and that meets the small scale, that meets the drainage area limit. Now, some of the other BMPs, why don't they have drainage area limits? Things like grass swales, vegetative filter strips. If you look into our design manual for those, you're going to find that they are only really able to treat on their own a relatively small area already, so we didn't feel a need to create another drainage area limitation for those. Green roofs really don't have drainage areas. And cisterns, you're reusing the water somewhere, so a drainage area limit doesn't really make that much sense. If you have irrigation use for it, then by all means, go ahead. The next table is table 5.2. These, again, are still green infrastructure BMPs, but they're no longer necessarily small scale. So you'll see that we have bioretention, infiltration, sand filter, just like from the first table. The only caveat here is that these don't need to meet the drainage area limit. But if they don't meet the drainage area limit, that means you no longer can use them for water quality or groundwater recharge. You can still use them for quantity, but you can only use them for quantity. We've also added 2 more. That's standard constructed wetlands and wet ponds. And the reason they fall into this is because they require significant drainage areas in order to function. So I think a standard constructed wetland, the smallest drainage area you can have is 10 acres, and a wet pond, the smallest is 20. And those really are outside the bounds of what we are considering small scale. You can still use them for quantity control, but they're not going to be small scale. One other caveat here is wet ponds. A regular wet pond with no vegetation or reuse or anything wouldn't meet our definition of green infrastructure. So you do have to put something into this design in terms of a reuse component in order to make it meet the definition of green infrastructure. And then this is table 5.3. These are the BMPs that you can only get some sort of a waiver because they don't meet the definition of green infrastructure. And that's blue roofs, extended detention basins, the other MTDs, sand filters, subsurface gravel wetlands, and wet ponds. So sand filters you saw are on pretty much every table. And that's because we have a design of sand filters that infiltrates and a design of sand filters that doesn't infiltrate. So if it infiltrates, it meets the definition of green infrastructure, and then you just have to decide if it's small or large scale. If it doesn't infiltrate, though, a sand filter is not going to meet our definition of green infrastructure, so it's going to fall into this table, regardless of how large or small scale it is. And wet ponds is also here again, and these are the wet ponds that someone doesn't incorporate that vegetative or reuse component into. Now, one other thing to think about with some of these is you could get creative. I've certainly seen some designs on the internet anyway, not necessarily applications we reviewed, of combination green roofs and blue roofs and things like that. And you can probably get yourself qualified as green infrastructure if you do something like that that's creatively using these together, because it'll still have what's necessary to meet the definition of green infrastructure, right? So if you have a green roof and a blue roof, well, you've done the treatment with vegetation. So the fact that you're then retaining it also is not necessarily a problem. It's not going to preclude you from being a green infrastructure. So you can combine them together and still use some of the aspects of these. Okay. That's pretty much it for the green infrastructure standards. So I'm going to go into some of the other changes we made now. This is a change we made to the water quality standard. And for any of you who are familiar with exactly how we did the water quality standard, under the current rules, it's triggered whenever you create a 1/4 acre of impervious surface. But in practice, we don't make anyone treat quality for rooftops or sidewalks or other things that we consider clean runoff. And that can be a little confusing because the 1/4 acre of new impervious surface could be all rooftop, and then you technically trigger the water quality standard, but then we don't make you do anything for it. So the implementation didn't really line up with the trigger for that. So what we've done is we've changed the trigger to line up with our implementation. That also does one other important thing that we wanted, and that's to capture other motor vehicle surfaces that aren't necessarily impervious. So if you think about, say, like a gravel parking lot, well, if someone creates a gravel parking lot, it's 1/2 of an acre. Well, that wouldn't be impervious surface, so it wouldn't have triggered the water quality standard under current rules. But under this, it will, because if it's a parking lot, it's motor vehicle surface, and it will trigger the rules. So scientific studies really show that, and I think it's quite logical, that dirt roads and gravel roads, and of course it depends on exactly how they're constructed, but a lot of dirt roads and gravel roads have a lot more total suspended solids that come off of them than a paved area. And this will require water quality treatment for those areas. And at the same time, we're no longer, it's being very clear in the rules now, rather than our frequently asked questions, that we don't require treatment for roofs or sidewalks. Again, that's consistent with our implementation today. And this is one of the things that we've included in the definition of major development, as we saw in the term regulated motor vehicle surface. Okay, and the next thing I'm going to talk about is the definitions we've added. So we've added a definition for regulated motor vehicle surface, and we've added a definition for regulated impervious surface. Now, these were concepts that were discussed in our frequently asked questions for a very long time, and we're just incorporating them into the rules. There's really two different concepts. If you think about it, once I go through them, motor vehicle surface, the regulated motor vehicle surface, the additional concepts there will be largely tied to water quality. And when you look to the definition of regulated impervious surface, the additional concepts there will be tied to water quantity. So the definition of regulated motor vehicle surface, of course, includes the creation of motor vehicle surface, but also it includes things that remove existing water quality treatment. So if you have, say, a roadway that has no curbs and no collection system, and it's surrounded by woods, well, that water just sheet flows off and goes into the woods and gets water quality treatment by doing that. Now you decide, hey, I'm not going to widen this road. I'm not going to put any new impervious surface, but I'm going to curb this road. I'm going to collect it. I'm going to discharge it straight down into the stream. Well, now you've lost that water quality treatment. And that's the concept that we're adding into the definition of regulated motor vehicle surface. So that's now going to count as regulated motor vehicle surface. It's going to make that project a major development if it's over the 1/4 acre, and they're going to have to do water quality treatment, again, if it's over the 1/4 acre. There's a few other things we've added in there, but they're all along the same lines. It's if you remove an existing BMP that's providing treatment, or it could also happen if you're in a combined sewer area, and in those areas, some of the flow makes it to the wastewater treatment plant, it gets treated there. So if you were to just simply disconnect that from the combined sewer system, although in practice that sounds like a great idea, you are also potentially eliminating some sort of water quality treatment if you do that, and we would want that to be incorporated into your new discharge. Similarly, with regulated impervious surface, it includes the creation of impervious surface, but also some other concepts that aren't necessarily the creation of impervious surface, but act similarly, like you have an existing collection system and you expand its capacity. or you create a new discharge point or something where you're potentially going to have flooding impacts downstream that need to be analyzed. So if you're going to create, if you're going to do that and it's significant enough to be major development, then that's going to have to be looked at from a quantity control perspective to make sure you're not causing any adverse impacts downstream. Continuing the clarifications to applicability here, we've also made it clear that quantity, quality, and groundwater recharge have to be met in each drainage area on site unless they converge before leaving the property. This was very clear in our previous rules for the water, well, not just very clear, it was in our previous rules for the water quality standard, but for some reason, it was not incorporated into the water quantity or groundwater recharge standards. Now I can get it from a groundwater recharge perspective. Drainage areas aren't necessarily the same as your recharge areas. We thought about coming up with a separate term for that or separate idea, but it seemed to just make things far more complicated than we needed it to be, so we just stuck with drainage area. But particularly from a quantity perspective, the fact that this wasn't previously incorporated into the rules, I don't understand why, because it allowed you to do your quantity control on one side of the site and then not on the other side and potentially adversely impact the property owner on this other side and still meet the rules. Of course, in practice, we would never let someone do that. We would tell them that they couldn't, but now we've actually modified the rules to make it very clear that you can't do that. Another thing that we've done is we've moved the requirement to do a groundwater mounding analysis from the groundwater recharge standard into that section 5.2, the standard for stormwater management measures, that's going to apply to everything. So it's just clear that it's not just if you're doing groundwater recharge that you need to do a groundwater mounding analysis. It's anytime you're doing an infiltration. We've also created a new chapter in the B&P manual if you haven't seen it. It's chapter 13, and that has extensive guidance on how to do a groundwater mounding analysis with a hand-tush spreadsheet. Another thing that we've done is a deed notice for green infrastructure. So under the non-structural stormwater management strategies that we currently have in place, there was a requirement that if you're going to be preserving something, you need to have a deed restriction, a conservation restriction for it. That makes a lot of sense. If you're preserving a forest as your means of non-structural strategies, you can't just cut it down after you get your approval. So you would have to deed restrict it. Thought about doing the same thing for green infrastructure, but decided that was too onerous. We are looking at trying to require people to do multiple green infrastructure BMPs throughout a site. So having a deed restriction or a conservation restriction on each and every one of those it just wouldn't work out very well. Anytime someone wanted to modify one of those or move one, or say they have pervious paving in their driveways, or they have rain gardens along the house, if they wanted to put in an addition, or they want to move their driveway, or they want to do anything, they would need to come to the department, to the commissioner, to get their conservation restriction lifted. That really isn't the intent of what we want to do. So we've just decided to do just a deed notice, and this deed notice is going to require that they incorporate the description of the BMP and its locational information, and we want that in state plane coordinates on their deed. And this will be in addition to the requirement that's already in our rules that they have the maintenance plan attached to the deed. So now on any property where there's going to be one of these infrastructure BMPs, they're going to have a description, locational information, and the maintenance plan. So really everything they need to know how to manage that BMP going forward. Also, this does provide a pathway in the rules now for a property owner to alter or replace a BMP, provided they go back to the review agency and they get the okay from that. So if you are a homeowner that happens to have one of these green infrastructure BMPs on your property, you can move it, you can replace it, as long as you can make sure that you're still providing that same quality, quantity, and recharge requirements, and you go back to the review agency to get approval. There are also a few changes that we incorporated that are related to combined sewer overflow. So as you are probably aware, we've got 21 municipalities in New Jersey that have combined sewer systems. A combined sewer system is one that carries both stormwater and sanitary wastewater in the same line, which is no problem when it's not raining, but whenever it rains, those systems overflow because there's not enough capacity to bring all that water to the treatment plant. So as we're requiring municipalities to figure out ways to eliminate their combined sewer systems through our other rules, through our NJAC rules, we're doing some of this to help give them every tool in the toolbox they possibly can to make that happen. So one of the things that we're doing is clarifying that water quality treatment is required for discharges in combined sewer systems. There is an exemption in the current rules, and it's still retained in the amended rules from the water quality standard for projects where you have an Egyptes permit with a TSS effluent limitation, numeric TSS effluent limitation. And that makes a lot of sense, right? If you already have an Egyptes permit for, say, your wastewater treatment plant, and you put your stormwater into the plant's process, well, you need to do your 80% TSS removal under the stormwater management rules because you're going through the treatment plant's process. It's going to remove more than 80% to begin with already. And an Egyptes permit with a numeric TSS effluent limitation is going to come with a requirement that you sample your stormwater before you discharge. So we're going to have proof that you actually met the water quality standards that way. So that exemption makes a lot of sense. But what we had seen is that sometimes developers would look at that and say, oh, I discharge into the combined sewer system, and that combined sewer system goes to the treatment plant. And the treatment plant has a numeric effluent limitation for TSS, so I don't have to do water quality on site. This is just going to make it clear that that doesn't fly. You have to do the water quality on site unless you, the property owner, are physically the entity that has the Egyptes permit with the TSS limitation. Next thing that we've done is we've clarified that water quantity control is required in tidal areas, except for discharges directly into lower reaches of major tidal water bodies. And this is kind of a reversal from the way the current exemption for discharge in tidal water body, in tidal flood hazard areas is set up. Currently, it kind of says you don't have to do quantity control unless there's going to be an adverse impact. And that puts the onus on the review agency to say, well, there's definitely going to be an adverse impact here, so I'm going to have to make you do quantity control, which is a tricky situation to be in because it's hard to prove by just looking at a plan that you're definitely going to have an adverse impact. You can say probably, but it's hard to prove that you're definitely going to have one. And this is going to reverse it around. So unless it's clear that you're not going to have an adverse impact, you have to do quantity control. And then the last thing we've done here is to create an option for a community basin. So this is going to allow and this is only going to apply in combined sewer areas. And this is going to allow a single large basin for quantity control that multiple developments can utilize in, say, an area of town where they're undergoing a redevelopment, big, large redevelopment project. They can have multiple developments use this basin for quantity control, and that way we can hopefully eliminate some additional combined sewer overflow by providing this quantity control. And at the same time, they would still have to do quality and recharge on their site. So it's not like they're getting out of incorporating green infrastructure on the property. It's just for quantity. And again, that's just, I don't know if anyone will ever use that, to be honest. Just an idea we came up with, and we wanted to give our combined sewer communities just every tool they could come up with. So this is just something we threw out there. Okay, last thing I really want to go over is the variance. Now, this is the existing variance standard at 7:8-4.6. This allows a municipality to grant a variance for stormwater management if they have a mitigation plan as part of their municipal stormwater management plan. And that mitigation plan has to identify what measures are necessary to offset the deficit created by granting the variance and ensure that mitigation happens in the same drainage area for the same design performance standards. And also, a municipality has to submit a written report to the county and to the DEP describing it. But that's it. There's really no clarity or anything here on exactly how you do this. So we've added a lot more clarity and a couple of restrictions. So first of all, on the previous slide, there was no restriction on when they granted variance. It didn't say that the designer or the developer has to even prove they couldn't do it on site. It just said if the municipality grants it. So now this is going to make it clear that they have to do it on site unless it's technically impractical to meet it on site for engineering, environmental, or safety reasons. And then even then, they still need to meet it on site to the maximum extent they can. And then the mitigation, they'll do off-site for just what could not be met on site. And it's also made it clear that the approval of variance applies only to the individual drainage area and design and performance standards. So if you say, I can't meet quality for some reason, and it's the municipality agrees, that doesn't mean you also don't do quantity on site. That just means you do your quality off-site as any mitigation. We've also added some clarity on when and how you construct a mitigation. There's a list here. This is one question we've gotten is, does the mitigation project have to be within the actual mitigation plan? So we've made it clear that no, the project doesn't have to be spelled out in the mitigation plan, but the mitigation plan has to be used to evaluate the project. So it could be spelled out in the mitigation plan, or the developer could propose it, and the mitigation plan just gives the municipality the tools to be able to evaluate whether or not that's appropriate. We're also now requiring that it be approved no later than preliminary or final site plan approval of the major development. I think that makes sense. You can't just defer your mitigation off into the future. It has to be located in the same HUC 14. So previously it just said drainage area. pretty unclear. I mean, we're all in the drainage area of the ocean. So this clarifies that it has to be in the same HUC 14. It has to be also constructed prior to a concurrent with the major development. So not just approved, but it also constructed prior to it concurrently. If you think about it, if we're saying you need to do this on site in order to not have an adverse impact, and you're saying, well, I'm going to do it off site because we can't do it on site, well, you need to construct the off site stuff first. Otherwise, your on site project could potentially have adverse impacts for your surrounding properties. Has to comply with infrastructure standards. The applicant or the party responsible for the maintenance of the major development has to be responsible for the mitigation project too. So you can't set up a third party LLC or something to do the mitigation for you. It has to be the same entity that is going to do the mitigation for the project itself. So let's say it's a residential development. You can have a homeowners association. Yes, you could have the homeowners association also be responsible for the mitigation project, but you can't just create some other third party to be responsible for that. You can turn it over to a government agency, but only if they basically only if you have a written agreement. And this also requires that the approved variance must be submitted to the review agency and the DEP within 30 days. It always said you had to submit it, but there was no deadline to ever submit it. So technically, no one was ever out of compliance with that, as long as they said, oh yeah, we were planning to do that, even if it was 10 years later. Now, I have one slide here to just go over what some of the mitigation standards look like for individual performance standards. This is for green infrastructure. There is a similar section that goes over what you have to do if it's quality, what you have to do if it's quantity, what you have to do if it's recharge. I think for the most part, those are pretty straightforward. You have to make up the deficit for what you can do on site. But also for time, I'm not going to go into every one of those. This is green infrastructure. And basically, it requires you to manage your or construct green infrastructure to manage an equivalent or greater area and amount of impervious surface than what you were supposed to do on site. So if you needed to manage 1 acre with green infrastructure on site and you couldn't do it, and that 1 acre was, say, a half acre of impervious surface, and when you do your mitigation offsite, it needs to manage at least 1 acre, and at least half of that needs to be impervious surface. It also excludes vegetative filter strips and grass swales as a sole measure of your mitigation. And that's just because it could never have been your sole measure of providing your green infrastructure on site in the first place. So it can't be your sole measure of mitigation. It has to be sized for the water quality design storm. That's very logical. And it's also subject to the drainage area limitations that we normally apply. Just a quick slide on some of the BMP manual changes. As I mentioned earlier, we adopted Chapter 13, which is our groundwater mounding guidance. We also released for public comment Chapters 5 and 12. Chapter 5 is how you do our calculations, basically, and Chapter 12 is going to be our new soil testing chapter. It was Appendix E. We decided it belonged in the manual rather than as an appendix. The public comment period's long closed on these, so if you had thoughts, we probably already incorporated them and you submitted them to us. We are planning to adopt these in the very near future. I have actually put them on our internal draft website already, and I'm just getting approval to get that posted onto our live website in the near future. One important thing to note on Chapter 5 is that it's going to allow infiltration in your quantity control routings in green infrastructure BMPs. Also, Chapter 12, while we haven't made a ton of changes to our soil testing requirements, we incorporated some new ideas, some new concepts, so some new soil testing requirements if you're going to be doing small-scale distributed green infrastructure systems. Because if you think about it, if you're going to be putting small-scale green infrastructure all over a site, having 2 soil profile pits in each one of them, particularly when maybe they're only 1,000 square feet in size in the first place, is kind of excessive when one soil profile pit might excavate the entire surface area of the BMP to begin with. So we have some less onerous requirements for those distributed systems. We also adopted a revised model ordinance that municipalities can use instead of having to create their own ordinance. And be aware that some additional changes will be coming when we finally adopt Chapter 5, because some of those ideas of how you're doing the calculations that are in there, we're going to have to carry over into some of the other chapters. Now, I do have some examples I can go over here if there's still time to do that. These are some questions that I often get about how some of the new standards, particularly the regulated impervious surface and regulated motor vehicle surface, are going to apply to roadway projects. So let's say you're reconstructing an existing roadway and nothing else. So it's over an acre, but you're not adding any new impervious surface, you're not adding any curbing, you're not adding any new collection system. That's technically a major development because it's over an acre of disturbance, because you're reconstructing more than an acre. But because you're not changing anything, you're not going to have to do quantity, you're not going to have to do anything for quantity control, because one of the ways of meeting quantity is to not change the hydrograph, and this would not change the hydrograph. You're not going to trigger water quality because you're not creating any new impervious surface, not creating any new motor vehicle surface, so it's not going to trigger water quality. And for recharge, it's not going to affect the amount of recharge happening on site, so you're not going to have to do anything for recharge. So while that could be a major development, you don't really have to do anything. It's when you start adding other things into the project, you start having to address stormwater management more thoroughly. So let's say you're adding a curb, you're adding curbs in a drainage system. Well, I briefly touched on this. Depends on the exact scenario there, but if there was existing water quality treatment happening, and that's going to happen in many, many cases if you're adding a curb and collection system where there wasn't one before, that's going to become, or that's going to trigger the water quality standard at that point. So you're going to have to do water quality if that's over a quarter acre. And you're also going to have to look at quantity control. Most likely, if you're adding a collection system where there wasn't one before, you're going to be rapidly speeding up the rate at which water gets to the river. So that's probably going to require you to do quantity control as well. Not going to affect recharge most likely significantly, so you might not have to recharge there, but you're going to have to be able to standards for sure. And then increasing the capacity of a drainage system, well, that's not necessarily going to affect the quality. So you probably won't have to do quality in this scenario, but you will have to do quantity control. It really does depend on the exact scenario. You know, if you're only increasing the capacity in a very limited section, and if the capacity downstream is not increased, so it still can't get to the water any faster, then well, maybe you don't have to do anything. But in a lot of cases, if you increase the capacity, you're going to have to do quantity control. And then the fourth one here is reconstruction with widening, and that really is going to push you to the point where you have to do all the standards. If that widening is over a quarter acre, you're certainly going to trigger water quality. You're going to have to do quantity control because you're definitely changing the hydrograph. And you're probably even going to have to do recharge because you're increasing impervious surface, so you're decreasing the amount of recharge that's happening. So that could trigger really having to do all the standards. I hope that's clear. That's pretty much it for my presentation. As John mentioned, we're going to do Q&A after both of the presentations, but feel free to keep typing them into the window, and we'll make sure to look at them and go over them. And of course, if you think of any question at any point in the future, here's my email address. You can always reach out with whatever questions you have. Thanks.
Gabe, thank you so much. That was awesome. Having been part of the original 2004 stormwater rule development process, I can tell you that the work that you've done on this iteration is a significant and good improvement, a significant change, good improvement. The clarity, the logic, the reasonability of it is terrific. So thank you for that. Sorry, I'm getting feedback probably from my own system here. I'm going to mute myself, other than to say, Jeremy, I'd like to bring you online, or you can do it yourself or whatever. You're up, and take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you, Gabe, for that. And basically, I'm going to attempt to just pick up where Gabe left off and kind of talk about how these will actually be implemented in the real world, so to speak. So one thing to keep in mind, and when I give this, to land development engineers such as myself, I always try to remind people this as well. What are we really trying to achieve here? And that helps make the rules much more obvious. You know, if you kind of have this in the back of your head that we're looking to mimic hydrology, reduce runoff rates, reduce volume, promote recharge, promote base flow, mitigate water quality. If you kind of keep that in your head, then everything kind of makes common sense. So what is in and out with the new rules? So probably the biggest thing is the redundancy in engineering calculations. In the current, and Gabe just mentioned this, but in the current rules, you have to ignore, it's really the BMP manual actually, you have to ignore infiltration. So in the, this new rule set, it's a whole different world now, because we'll be able to count infiltration. I'm going to go into that in some detail, but this just shows kind of a pre and post same development, what it might look like, what might be different. You'll see here that in the one on the left, you've got, with traditional wet pond, you might have a few BMPs throughout, or some, non-piped stormwater, something like that. But for the most part, you'd have like an end of pipe system, as you see there. In the new approach, we might have a combination of things such as roof recharge, pervious driveway aprons, a variety of small-scale bioretention basins, and then you'll see the resulting wet pond at the end while it's still there, and that's still green infrastructure, but it'll be much smaller because now we've decentralized the system. We're addressing the stormwater throughout the site as opposed to the end of the pipe. And by doing that, there's actually the potential to get more development yield. So you'll see, if you compare the two, you'll see in the yellow there that there's 2 additional units actually shown, which is important, was important to the regulated community because that was a way to help kind of offset the costs of constructing all this green infrastructure throughout the development. So it's really a win-win. Developers are getting a better development. At the same time, we're achieving a far superior result in terms of stormwater management. So that's basically this bottom thing here, just saying that benefit. So in terms of how the rules lay out, I thought the New Jersey Future Guide, the Developers Green Infrastructure Guide, there's a 2.0 version that really lays it out very well. They have this nice flow chart that's in that guide. By the way, this is a free guide, just to plug it because I was involved with that. I get this off their website. There's both an online version and then a PDF, quote unquote hard copy version. So feel free to avail yourselves of that if you want to look at a more, kind of user-friendly version of these rules. But this tree goes through all the different types of GI that you might use under different scenarios. And then there's tons of detail in this manual, from a practical perspective, what those look like. So definitely something worth, saving that as a link on your computer or downloading the PDF. So this is some of the content from within that we had some side-by-side comparisons within the manual that help illustrate the rule changes. The one I showed you already with the subdivision, but here's what a commercial change might look like. You see on the left side, you got a bioretention system, kind of end-of-pipe system. In the right-hand side, you'll see now that bioretention system's been replaced with a quick service restaurant. So, where's all the stormwater management? Well, it's been distributed. So throughout the site now, you've got things like roof recharge, you've got porous pavement, you've got small-scale bioretention facilities all over the site. So you're actually getting more development yield, but at the same time, a superior stormwater management system because the site's both decentralized and you're getting the added benefits of green infrastructure in terms of, overall effective treatment of the water. So this is just kind of blowing up on it. You can see the bioretention system in the top right. And then this slider is actually live in the manual on the internet. So that's kind of a cool way to go back and forth. But here you'll see we've added the porous pavement, we've added the bioretention. And it's important to remember, too, that green infrastructure is not just doing basic suspended solids. The green infrastructure is also capable of doing thermal buffering so we don't get overly heated water coming off these hot surfaces directly into streams. It also is very effective at nutrient loading, whether that be phosphorus or nitrogen. So there's many other benefits, even though they're not formally regulated with a numeric standard. Green infrastructure is still achieving that. So it's gone way beyond the old-fashioned detention basin with the 3-inch orifice and, just trying to get to suspended solid reduction. And again, you can see the whole site with some additional bioretention. So stormwater management will count now fully. And probably the biggest thing is the infiltration. It allows the infiltration at the design rate, which is basically with a factor of safety of 2. You do have to, and this is very important, and I'll talk about this more later, but you have to check the groundwater mounding. So it's not just whether the soils can handle it, but whether based on the drainage area, the shape of the BMP, whether or not the groundwater mound is going to retard, from a routing standpoint anyway, the flow of water into the ground. So there is a little bit more complexity from a design standpoint and a calculation standpoint, but it's certainly well worth doing. You're going to get a better design overall by looking at this fully from a realistic aspect. But it's not just infiltration. Non-infiltration, there are ways to count that too. So you should always be counting your GI, and that's something I really preach to the design engineers to make sure that they're taking full credit, because we want this to be well received by the regulated community. And the key part of that is that they're not just experiencing extra costs of green infrastructure, but receiving benefit on the back end, as I showed in some of those side-by-side examples. So this is a way in a non-infiltration BMP. Reduced curve number method is a great example of how that can be done, which I have some additional slides on. So reduced curve number method is essentially transforming the curve number based on the volume of the BMP. So, traditional curve number for impervious, for instance, would be 98. But if you've got some small scale BMPs that are servicing that impervious surface, maybe that goes down to 88 or something like that, depending on the exact volume. So it's a way to transform that curve number for that particular drainage area. And then when you route your end of pipe system, now you're using that area that has that small scale BMP as a CN of 88. And then that inherently reduces the size required for that end of pipe system. This will be in the recording, so you'll be able to go back and look at this later, but this just kind of defines what all those different variables were in the equation. So Gabe touched on this already. There is this new chapter on groundwater mounding. It relies on the hand-touche method. It's fairly straightforward. So those of you that are engineers, you'll be somewhat familiar with it. And there's a lot of good examples and a lot of clarity actually in the BMP manual. So it's definitely a chapter that's worth reading cover to cover. You heard from Gabe that these new chapters are about to come out in terms of Chapter 5 and Chapter 12. The Chapter 5 revision is actually the one that's going to allow infiltration. There'll be additional changes to Chapter 9, which covers the individual BMPs that will mirror that, basically allowing the infiltration. And we'll talk about some of the details. Very important is the revised soil testing. This is really a step up from the former Appendix E. The methods and procedures are laid out much better in a lot more detail, help kind of deal with the typical mistakes that are made. One key thing in soil testing is, in order to do the groundwater mounding, in addition to the soil characteristics, you have to know the depth or thickness of the saturated zone. So a continuous boring is necessary to do that. Otherwise, you can assume a 10-foot thickness, which might be fine on a typical convenience store site, something like that. That's relatively small, probably not worth going beyond that. But a site that's anything really bigger than that, it's going to be worthwhile to get that. So that's something you should be seeing in submissions, with the geotech reports, is some additional data with regard to the groundwater mounding. So in terms of the approach, I'm always trying to lay out for design engineers kind of what are you going to do different now? And then for you folks, primarily as regulators, what are you going to see different? So what you should see in terms of the submissions is a lot of small scale green infrastructure. And there's a regulatory reason for that, of course, but also the smaller and more distributed the green infrastructure is, the more credit you can get for it. Because the groundwater mounding becomes much less of a factor when you have small scale green infrastructure distributed all over the site. The more concentrated they are, the more of an issue groundwater mounding is. So if you want to fully capture all this benefit from counting infiltration, you really want that distributed. There's some other inherent benefits to that as well. The more distributed there are, the less likely there is to be a wholesale failure, because if any one BMP were to fail for whatever reason, it's only one of many, as opposed to having one end of pipe infiltration basin. If that fails, well, now the whole site doesn't operate. So there's definitely a lot more security because now it would require multiple failures in order for a site to holistically fail. I have on here this last bullet about forested retention. I have some slides on that later, so I'll show you that. Another key thing to really take advantage of this is it has to be thought of right from the beginning. I know sometimes the districts are asked to have pre-application meetings. That would be a great time to remind the applicant and their professionals, to really look at holistically, not just at stability or not just at end of pipe stormwater, but really go through the whole process up front and plan in the stormwater. I think those engineers will find, the applicant's engineers will find, they'll actually get more yield out of the project if they do it right from the beginning and actually to plant it in, and put the facilities in the right places too. It's not just at the bottom of the hill. In many cases, it's going to be all over the site, in the perimeter, in the middle, and if it's planned properly, that can be fully integrated. We always kind of map soils as part of concept planning, but now we want to go kind of beyond that and really use every leftover area. So you really need to have a full understanding of what the soils look like site-wide. Gabe had mentioned in his presentation that there is some ability to reduce the amount of soils testing when you have consistent conditions. I think that'll be very important. But if you have a variable type of site, it's going to pay though to do all that work up front then and really understand what you're dealing with where, so you can customize those BMPs in each part of the site to be maximum effectiveness. And that's really going to help, again, one, be most effective from a stormwater management standpoint, but also get the most bang for the buck in terms of creating these BMPs. Another thing to consider is whether you can get some multiple function out of the BMPs beyond just stormwater management. So for instance, one of the things we've successfully done is created BMPs that are kind of around or in the view shed of an outdoor seating area from a restaurant, or have that intertwined into a public area. It might be in a playground or something where now it's not just functioning as stormwater management, but it's actually creating a view shed or a park-like setting to use as well. Pre-treatment is also very important. 4-bay or another small-scale BMP in front of the table 5.2 or 5-2 large-scale BMPs is going to be very important from an infiltration perspective. So again, that's something to remind, if you're having those pre-application meetings, kind of remind folks that that's a key element. This maybe isn't as applicable to the districts, but it's something I just like to point out. Bioretention is definitely going to be, I think, one of the most popular choices when it comes to implementing GI for a number of reasons. One, they look great. Two, it's very effective from basically every regulated aspect. But it certainly goes beyond that. Bioretention is very effective at nutrient removal. I have found, though, in doing some DEP grant work that depending on the mix, it can actually increase the problem. So you could actually have more phosphorus, for instance, going out than coming in. And that all has to do with manure and biosolids. So basically, keeping that out of the bioretention is the key thing. You want it based on organic matter, plant-based materials, no manure biosolids. You want the phosphorus to be down to 25 to 100 milligrams per kilogram by the Melick 3 method. And these are kind of relatively easy to achieve in commercial production. The other part of it that's important is the aggregate. So it's not just the organics, but the actual the sands and so forth. We have found that keeping the fine and very fine sand to a maximum of 25% is very important. Still kind of working out what a minimum coarse percentage might be, but I can tell you that the more uniformly graded the aggregate is, the more successful it is, because it just can't bind up. We found they take a lot more abuse. And that's true in just straight infiltration, even though when it's not bioretention, where you just have an engineered sand layer. A uniform coarse sand as the top layer, that top 6-inch layer, is really a lot more resilient than maybe just your typical quote unquote K5 sand would be, because the K5 is really quite a few different mixes can qualify as a K5, but not all of them are as resilient as a uniformly graded coarse sand would be in terms of maintenance. So Gabe already went over these tables, so I'm not going to spend too much time on the tables. What I do want to go through is kind of show you what these would look like. So on table 5.1, this is a small scale bioretention facility, and this is a great example of kind of double duty. It really is actually performing triple duty in this particular application. So as you can see in the background, this is a residential area. It's essentially 3 townhome buildings surrounding it. So this basin is providing stormwater attenuation, water quality, recharge, but also it's providing a view shed now. All these windows, instead of just looking out on a sea of asphalt, they've got this very attractive garden area. So it's substantially better view sheds from the windows. Also, from a traffic perspective, they had to be able to turn around this area. So providing this BMP essentially created a boulevard effect where vehicles could circulate around much more easily. It's much more organized than if this was just an open asphalt area. So it's safer, more efficient, looks better, and a far superior job in terms of stormwater management. And now the end of pipe basin in this development is actually smaller because you're able to capture runoff in these small scale facilities throughout the site. Parking bioretention, I think you're going to see a lot of this, particularly in multifamily or commercial applications. Don't have to be all that big. The left side here is actually in a church parking lot. And you can see it's not a particularly wide island. It's no wider than you would normally have, but you're getting recharge, you're getting water quality. And then in this case, it actually ultimately goes off to an infiltration basin, but you're essentially getting pre-treatment here. So it's protecting that basin. The one on the right was actually in Newport. This is a commercial shopping center. I like the way they did it here. They had a flush curb that kind of kept the asphalt pavement nice and neat and straight. And then they had, these relatively attractive wheel stops just to keep somebody from running right through it. But because it's open like that, has this gravel edge, it kind of keeps the stability and then slows that water down as it's coming off of this asphalt. And then it goes into that landscaped area where you're getting the recharge and water quality. Sand filters, we don't use them that often, but there are times in redevelopment projects and whatnot that these can make sense depending on what you've got going on. This is a kind of a hybrid. You'd heard before, Gabe mentioned that you might be surprised to hear MTDs are included as BMPs. Of course, it's not just any MTD, it's MTDs that are based in some kind of green infrastructure. So this would be an example of that. This is an old castle system here. What's happening is the water's coming in just like any old inlet, and then it's going into that box there where it's distributed out to either side. So you can see here in the near part of the photo, that's kind of the outbound. So the major floatables are caught inside the structure, essentially on a shelf. Then that water comes out of the sides, goes down through the bioretention soil mix, is picked up in an under drain at the bottom of that concrete trough, and then goes out into the storm sewer that's collecting it. In a really large event, there's an overflow inside the box. So if you were in a major storm, it would then, whatever can't go through the water quality system would bypass and go out. So you're still getting flood protection, but for the vast majority of storms, you're going to be going through this bioretention system. And you can see here, it's very narrow, very small profile. So it's not changing your geometry. These are actually retrofits done under a DEP grant that didn't require disturbing this existing multi-use path or the roadway in any significant way. Porous pavement is one of my favorites. You get really all four types of water quality or stormwater treatment, I should say, because you're getting attenuation, you're getting water quality, you're getting low impact development because you're disconnecting impervious, and you're getting groundwater recharge. Some additional benefits, and you see this in the picture in the top right, snow melt is much faster because you're getting air circulation under the snow and ice. And then also as it melts, you're not getting refreeze because the water is going down into the subsoils as opposed to running across the parking lot, creating that black ice. So it's safer from a slip and fall perspective. Also, the friction coefficient of porous pavement is much greater, so it's a much safer surface to be on. One thing I'll note too is some of you that have been doing this a while may have some bad impressions of porous pavement. You may have seen aggregate that's getting displaced by vehicle tires and all. One of the kind of breakthroughs is the DOT spec has a polymer modified binder, and that has made a world of difference now in aggregate stability. So definitely you want to make sure we're specifying the DOT spec or something similar to that. And it still makes sense to put it in the right spot. You can see in the picture on the left, we have standard asphalt in the main drive aisle where obviously you're getting a lot more vehicular traffic. And then on the right side of that picture, the picture on the left, you can see it changes into porous pavement. And the BMP manual does allow up to a 3-to-1 loading ratio of standard asphalt to porous. So that's definitely something to take advantage of and design constraints. And this is actually, the picture on the left is my oldest installation of porous pavement. This goes back, I think it was actually installed in 2007 if memory serves. So it's been there for quite a while. You can see it's got a few spots where it's clogged up from, frankly, lack of maintenance. But the porous pavement the pavement itself has so much capacity that you could lose a substantial portion, of the surface and still have plenty of capacity to get through to the underlying soils. Grass pavers, this only makes sense in certain locations, but this particular project's out in Tinton Falls. It's the overflow parking for a major sports complex, but it's a real nice alternative that's very stable, but at the same time, you're getting great water quality, especially, for all those times when it's not in use, it's actually a stormwater management facility. Green roofs, these typically only make sense where real estate is very expensive. So both of these are in Newark actually, and but in those type of locations they make a lot of sense. Plus they do double duty as an amenity area. These can be even done as community gardens for residents or things like that, or outdoor seating areas, whatever the case might be. Cisterns, if you have particularly like single family homeowners, this is a good thing to do. It'd have the barrels for irrigation reuse. We also can do on the right, you see we've got these like cistern type recharge facilities. Those work well in certain cases, particularly large lot single family dwellings. That can be a good solution. Vegetative filter strips. These are particularly good at poor soil areas where you don't have good soils, good recharge soils. It could be clays or other kind of restrictive soils. Maybe you have shallow groundwater. These can be a great approach to provide some water quality to break up the connectivity of impervious surfaces. In terms of table 5.2, you've got your infiltration basins, and I'll just say again how important that uniformly graded coarse sand is on the top. So even if the soils are good, even if they're K5, K4 sands in the existing condition, they're typically well graded. Bank run sands are usually fairly well graded. So we have found that it's worth spending the money on an engineered, uniformly graded sand on that top layer, and that basically protects that existing subsoil and will take a lot more abuse, require a lot less maintenance. So that's really a key point of making these basins work. Subsurface infiltration, still a good part of 5.2. You see these a lot in commercial types of projects, such as the examples here. The storm trap systems can be good, again, particularly in high value real estate where you need to get a lot of volume, but it has to be underground. That's a great way to go. When the constraints aren't quite as bad, then the perforated pipe, like you see on the right, is an excellent solution. Constructed wetlands, one of my favorites in really poor soils areas. When you've got shallow groundwater, you've got clay soils or restricted horizons. This is kind of a unique application. What we did here, it's in the foreground of the picture. I should actually add another photo to this slide. But there's a porous pavement parking lot just above this, just uphill of it. And even though the soils themselves don't recharge, what we did here, and it's working very well, is that porous pavement, the water comes down through the porous pavement stone and then leaches out into the shallow soils that feed the wetland. So instead of that pavement just giving a slug of water during the rain event to this wetland, it actually bleeds out over several days and really helped this wetland succeed because they really kept a more uniform hydration. So, great solution when you've got really poor soils or shallow groundwater. Large bioretention, we use this quite a bit, this type of approach. This happened to be in a residential community, but this can work anywhere. Very attractive, works well in a commercial setting where you don't want to have an ugly basin kind of up front or in public view. Just really a great setting. It's easy to kind of envision here how you can incorporate walking trails or park benches or make an outdoor seating area, overlook this. A lot of ways you can take advantage of this in the layout. Wet ponds, something else, again, similar to constructed wetlands when you've got either shallow groundwater or poor soils, another great way to go. These wet ponds are also very good at thermal buffering from receiving streams. The one on the left, for instance, discharges to the Shark River, C1 water. So having this here that really kind of dispels a lot of that heat that you're getting. One of the requirements for wet ponds to count is that 50% of the edge has to be some kind of like littoral shelf. So you'll see actually in both of these basins, it's 100% happens to be designed that way. So you've got this nice littoral shelf all the way around that's uptaking nutrients and so forth. And then you've got the wet pond itself helping to mitigate those thermal impacts and of course, dealing with your peak rates. And then from a volume perspective, the wet ponds, and in fact, both of these are set up that way. These are the source water for the irrigation system. So it allows the communities that these basins serve, instead of using well water, as more typically the case historically, now you're using your first drop of water is coming from surface runoff. And in both cases, these wet ponds were designed to hold a certain amount of water. We typically do at least 6 inches, sometimes 12 inches or more of the depth will hold water for irrigation purposes. So you can actually get a fairly significant amount of irrigation water and really minimize the need to hit a well in order to feed the irrigation system. So I promised this before, kind of some innovations that I think will come out of the green infrastructure rules. And there are many, many things. Gabe alluded before to using green roofs and blue roofs kind of in combination. That would be one example. I think another example, particularly in the coastal plain of New Jersey, would be to use forested areas as a best management practice. So what might that look like? We want to take advantage basically of the highly absorptive characteristics of, pinelands type wooded areas. I think these are a great alternative to the traditional infiltration basin. For those of you that work in South Jersey, I mean, how many times have you seen a pine forest clear cut to make way for an infiltration basin that then, subsequently struggles to work due to poor installation or due to lack of maintenance, whatever the case? When you have this kind of natural system, they're so much more resilient because it's alive. It can fix itself. So it does get clogged up. You've got, all these plants and trees, that are basically breaking through the soil layers constantly. And of course, you got a whole ecosystem. It's not just plants and trees, but you have all kinds of insects and worms, things like this. They're constantly breaking up that surface so it doesn't clog. Also, you're getting better performance from a water quality standpoint because you've got all these plants and animals that are uptaking or transforming nutrient loading. So we're looking at different ways, and I'll just caveat here that the DP has not approved any of these yet. These are just things, we actually have a private grant that we're kind of looking at. These are some early approaches being looked at how they might be sized, but nothing has been approved yet. So this is kind of a work in progress. I won't spend too much time on it, but that's at least some of what we're thinking on how you might size a forest system. And then kind of what it would look like. This is a commercial project in Brick Township. And basically you've got a large parking area and it directly flows into a pine forest area. So, this is, literally the pine forest that was there before the site was cleared. And this area just discharges in, to it. It's actually been in place for quite a while and there's no wetland vegetation or any kind of change that's occurring. And I would submit to you, even if it did, that wouldn't be a bad thing. Even if the ecosystem did adjust, I don't think it's a bad thing. I still think this is superior to a cleared infiltration basin. But in this case, it's been so effective that the water's just not staying in the soil profile long enough to change the vegetation. It's going down, it's recharging relatively rapidly. So good example as to what that might look like. So, similar to Gabe, I'm happy to answer questions. I'm on my active acquisitions email a lot more often, so that's probably the better address, but I do check both regularly. That's my cell phone there, so, feel free to call or text. I feel very passionate, I know Gabe does, about stormwater management and happy to help. Gabe Dave's probably better to hit if they're more rule-based questions. But if your question's more like, how do I, practically achieve this in a real, site? Because I have so much experience doing that. I'm happy to help be a sounding board or give you some ideas for how you might do that.
Hey, Jeremy, thank you so much. The examples that you cited, seeing a picture of the things that we're describing in rules and BMPs is invaluable. And especially for us who we deal with pictures all the time, site plans and what they look like, and then seeing them out in the field, trying to envision or imagine, something based on what you're reading in a rule text, even in our own standards is rather difficult. And then just the breadth of exposure of projects that you've had. I know porous pavement has always been, given a lot of us agita because of the imagination of the pavement freezing in the wintertime. And yet you've got evidence to indicate that just the opposite may be true, that due to the design and construction of it, may actually enhance snow melt and reduce ice buildup and that sort of thing, and not actually be the very problem that we had imagined it to be. So those kinds of things are just invaluable to have. I am going to, if people are still there, they're still slugging down coffee and staying with us, I am going to take just a couple of minutes to try to just offer my comments about what I think. Well, I don't have a whole lot of experience with this, and I'm trying to use my imagination, so to speak, to see how and where our standards may interact with new green infrastructure, designs. So here's, if you guys can see my screen, hopefully you can. Here is a couple of things that I am thinking about. So the first big thing in the room is infiltration credit. For years and years and years, and still to some extent, the standards do not recognize infiltration as a means to reduce peak rates of runoff. Although we do allow that for the downstream aspect of offsite stability, and that's because of the reduction factors, and because downstream is somewhat nebulous and ambiguous. Where is downstream? And these days, downstream simply means in the woods. We very rarely have an actual stream that we're downstreaming to. So the point stability is really becomes part of the problem, and because you have such defined conditions there, and that's where we have not heretofore given credit for infiltration. Obviously, now we have a conflict, between our rules and DEP's BMP designs. We have talked to Jeremy at length about this. We mean myself and Frank and a few others. And we recently brought this issue up at the state committee meeting, which was like Monday last, I think. And the state committee has appointed, not named anyone, but given the go-ahead for a small task group to get together to look at how we might modify our standards to come in line with the new green infrastructure credits that are available. And so some of that is pragmatic from our standpoint. In years past, there was a huge percentage of failure. And with the advent of some of the better DEP designs, purposeful design is probably a better way to say it, and the soil testing criteria, now the mounding analysis and so forth, taking it even further. A couple of years ago, some of you may recall that we did a massive statewide sweep of infiltration structures. It was a joint effort between NJDA, the districts, DEP staff, and quite a few consulting engineers, and Jeremy was a big push behind that. And he compiled some stats. I don't know off the top of my head, Jeremy, I want to say 80 or 88% did we find that was that were passing, that were functioning when they were properly cited and when they were properly designed and built. We actually had a complete reversal from 70% failure to 80+% success. So some of our reservation for infiltration has been taken away simply because better practices are out there. Some of it is also philosophical. We are looking at a policy that is concerned about what may happen in the future long after we have the ability to regulate it. And it does beg the question, you know, are we regulating designs submitted to us, or are we regulating things in the future that we can't know for sure, can't predict, and can't control? So those two things need to be considered along with the changes in the BMP manual, as well as improved and more, I think, public awareness, you know, the construction public, the engineering public. It's much more culturally acceptable and much better understood now in the engineering community, rather than just stick a basin at the bottom of the site and let it fill up with water. We'll call it infiltration basin. And, you know, a month later, we would call that a lake, and it stayed a lake. So that's a long time ago that's the way that was approached. So I think that's a big thing that we need to look at in terms of the changes in GI. One of the questions I had was if we are going to approve infiltration, normally we review things that we approve. And I have a concern about doing duplicative reviews that should be being done by municipal engineers. I don't think we need to do that, but I think we need to find a mechanism so that districts have assurance that when they say okay for offsite stability based on infiltration, then we have some assurance, some comfort level that the infiltration design has been properly executed in accordance with the DEP requirements. So that's a logic problem for us to figure out. We are not familiar with the reduced curve number method. I had mentioned this to Jeremy through an email a couple days ago. And for those of you who are familiar with the old NRCS ponding factor, it has somewhat of a similar intent, by you're accounting for areas that take out runoff, they hold the runoff, and therefore the overall effect is if there's either a smaller drainage area or a smaller curve number. The ponding factor method is much grosser in the way it treats things, and it also is for much larger areas. We're talking about very small areas here, you know, less than 2 acres and probably quite a bit less than that. And it gets down to the point where, I mean, how would you even consider a ponding factor on something that's a quarter or a third of an acre? It just, you know, so we need to become familiar with the reduced curve number method, because we'll see that show up and then we'll start asking questions. This is more of an observation. And Jeremy, I think it was you that mentioned this, and I'm glad you mentioned offsite stability to distributed network of stormwater management systems, devices, structures. I think there's actually an advantage, a positive advantage for our concerns for offsite stability. And you grabbed the thunder there, buddy. So when you put all your eggs in one basket and there's a failure, you've got 100% failure. You could have 2, 3, 4, 5 distributed infiltration GI type structures, and if 1 or 2 of them fail, you still have 70, 80% of them still working, and the likelihood that some of them are discharging in different directions, again, same thing. You're not having failure all in one place by one structure. You're distributing that failure around the site, and it's also a lot easier to maintain and fix. I think this is more for us. We do this anyhow, but I think we're going to have to really work with the development community. If we're going to really rely more on infiltration, especially for mitigating peak flows, that means during construction, we really do need to have some good vigilance, you know, on the site to make sure that those things don't get contaminated. They're going to be the lowest point on the site underground, and they're going to be the most vulnerable to the worst part of the erosion process. Worst, like you could say it's worse. It's worse in terms of the fines that come off that are not trapped or filtered by inlet protection and silt fence and all that stuff. They're going to go down into those infiltration structures. Those are the kinds of things we need to figure out how to properly take care of and protect them. Long-term maintenance, that's a consideration. That is, beyond the scope of our program. Obviously, once we hand the keys over at the end, final report of compliance, our involvement from a regulatory perspective is complete. We do have an opportunity, all districts do, to offer us for doing inspections of structures through our H&H database. That's just a little shameless plug there. But long-term maintenance, just from a municipal perspective, if we're going to put all this stuff underground and out of sight is out of mind, I'm concerned that in a couple of years people forget about it because they're not sitting there looking at it. We may end up with surprise peak flow growth. Like, where is this coming from? Nobody knows. Well, it's coming from underground. And then just sort of coupled with that is I would like to see somehow, I know it's not part of the rules or anything, Gabe, but a long-term monitoring, since this is a little bit of new territory for us, to make sure that the green infrastructure structures, especially the infiltration structure parts, are working and they have viable and usable and enforceable maintenance requirements, and that we don't end up with unintended catastrophic failure due to, as I said before, out of sight, out of mind. GI and OSS conflicts. I mentioned this, I'm just going to zip through this. So it was based on a 70% failure rate. Pinelands, I don't remember the exact date, but I think it was prior to DEP's uptick in their design requirements, but they had done a study in their own area, in their own backyard, and they found a similar rate of failure. But then we did our study, and again, I think it was 80 or 88% of the structures that we examined were actually working when they were sited properly. Now, we did actually visit some that were sited poorly. I remember one of them was in Warren County, and they put a quote-unquote infiltration structure, a basin, surface basin, in an area, and that the soil in that little area, you could scoop it out and take it to your local pottery shop and make a beautiful fired bowl out of it. It was so full of clay and fines, there was no way it was going to work. So I mentioned, that it's not just a technical aspect; it's a policy or a philosophical issue that we need to tackle as well. Are we regulating things that we can't foresee, we can't predict, and long after our presence is no longer required on site? So I don't see a whole lot of conflicts with what is being presented by DEP. In fact, just the opposite. I see a lot of reduced conflicts and a lot of logic, a lot of clarity, a lot of reasonability that was not there in the past. And I mentioned we'll be looking at this immediately. I asked Jeremy if he'd be interested in participating in a group discussion like that, and his hand shot up in the air before I could even get the last sentence out of my mouth. He was like, "Oh, pick me." So yeah, Jeremy, we'd like to invite you to be part of that. So I mentioned about verifying proper design on the plan. We don't currently review for infiltration. We just look at, hey, if it fails, what's your peak flow rate? Are you going to cause an erosion problem? We don't want to duplicate the municipal review, and we need to come up with some system mechanism, maybe a checklist of parameters. Jeremy had mentioned that. I was thinking that the designer could, since we're usually the last ones to get the plans, everybody else has issued their permits, DEP, the municipality. With that assumption being potentially true and continuing to be true, it's possible we could get verification from the municipality that the infiltration designs have meet the DEP requirements, and then we would accept that. That's just a thought. That's not policy on my part. Just looking for ways to make this streamlined and not duplicate things. Jeremy mentioned the reduced curve number method. I don't have time to go into that, and I am not that familiar with it myself. I'd have to study up on it as well. That's something that that we need to learn and become familiar with, because we will see that show up in our plans. And basically explaining that once you account for GI, you basically can back calculate a curve number, and you end up with basically a lower curve number than you would if you didn't have that GI there. And therefore, your remaining areas get some benefit hydrologically from having these GI structures out on the site. And I mentioned ponding factors. More precise than the ponding factor, a lot more precise. Well, as precise as this stuff can be anyhow. This is from, I was looking for references for the reduced curve number method, and Maryland Department of Environment, that's where Rick McEwen, he's a professor of engineering in University of Maryland, and so I'm not surprised to find this in the Maryland's DEP. But note what they talk about is small-scale uniformly distributed practices, and that's kind of where the ponding factor approach differs from this, is that ponding factors for many acres, very large scale, really agricultural watersheds. This is for much more, bombing coordinate precise level of analysis. And this is something I just wanted to illustrate. I snagged a couple of those images. In our current means and method, we have 1 point of discharge, 1 point of failure. And if it goes down, then we have erosion. And now what do? Especially if it's an underground infiltration structure, you get a lot of problems. With the new approach, I don't know that this is 100% true, because I have not seen the designs actually in hand yet. But using my imagination, which is good, bad, or otherwise, a distributed network of infiltration and bioretention structures, I would imagine potentially has distributed, not only themselves are distributed, but their points of discharge are distributed. And as Jeremy mentioned, if this one over here fails, it doesn't necessarily mean that the ones over here and here are going to fail. So I'm thinking that for our stability purposes and questions, this actually may turn out to be an unintended big bonus, because we have, spread the error out around site, and we have lower risk in any one location. I actually like that idea a lot. Increased vigilance, we just got to be, very, very careful. I don't want to oversell that, but that's, we try to be careful now, but out on sites, you're dealing with compact sites in a lot of cases, and there just isn't a lot of room to put filters and the inlet protection other than in the inlet itself. There's no room for settlement basins and things like that. It's good. They're just going to have to be super careful, and somehow that's going to have to become part of the construction culture out there. It's one thing to do all this on paper and it looks good, but when you go out in the field and it's a muddy, rainy day and they're tromping around out there with dozers and track hose, that's the real world, and they need to embrace this new GI approach as much as we do. And long-term maintenance, I'm anticipating through the MS4 inspection process, and I mentioned we offer a service for that. It's not a regulatory thing, but we just do it because we have the database for it. But I think the towns are really going to have to step up their effort to make sure that these are inspected and kept in good working order. And if they don't, if they just brush it off, I think in a few years, if these things aren't maintained, they're all of a sudden going to be a big surprise. Well, where's all this water coming from? I'm wondering about whether or not we need to verify that the systems are clean prior to our issuing the final report of compliance. That you could consider that to be part of our purview from a regulatory standpoint, because it is going to be on our plan, and we are taking some degree of responsibility for them, whether we get them cameraed or we have systems jetted out or vacked out. We may want to make sure that they're clean before we final them. And lastly, long-term monitoring. I'd like to know how they work over time. Maybe in a couple of years we could go back and do something similar to what we did a few years ago, where we do a statewide sweep and actually check to see how they're working. So with that, I am going to stop sharing, and I'm going to, so I can see the chat box. So Jeremy and Dave, if you guys want to, you can unmute your mics. I'm going to scroll back up. I've been keeping a few questions, but I'm going to do my best to try to ferret them out and call them out, and whichever one of you or both of you want to answer, that'd be great. So Joe Dunn asked for a statutory reference, and I think Jeremy, you provided that almost ad nauseum there. Thank you very much. Jeremy, you had there was someone posed a question, and the very first question, and I kid you not, what if? I know my people. What if? Where is that? What if a project that is removing parking traffic areas and replacing with mixed use, would this still apply? And Jeremy, you had I think a comment there, a number of caveats to the question above. So how about, since you've kind of jumped into that, if you could speak to that, and then Gabe, if you wanted to also examine that, because that ties into something that a couple other people asked about. How do you consider like pavement that is going, let's say, from asphalt base to maybe a gravel base, or even a new surface that's gravel based? But anyhow, to this question, Jeremy, if you want to speak to that, and then Gabe, you want to jump in on it?
Sure. So the caveats come out of exactly what the details of the site are and the existing condition and exactly what's proposed. So for instance, if you had a site that was largely asphalt being redeveloped into maybe a multi-family community where now a lot of that's to become rooftop, that's not going to be that regulated motor vehicle surface as a rooftop. So in that sense, you might actually be able to comply with your water quality simply with that change. But say you're on a partially developed site, there's no curbing, it just kind of goes off into a wooded or grassy area, and then off into the street. But now in the redevelopment, all of a sudden you're going to curb it and formalize it to a storm sewer system, collect it. Now you might actually be creating, and under the regulated impervious surface definition and the motor vehicle surface definition, you would actually be exacerbating, and that would count toward that quarter acre. So that's why the details really matter. At the end of the day, it's net impervious surface, but it's not as simple as comparing one impervious surface to another. Is it a motor vehicle surface? And that can be, it's not just asphalt. That could be gravel. It could be dirt. If it's a motor vehicle surface, that counts under the new definition. So that's important. And then also, is it rooftop? Is it something that doesn't require, it's outside that motor vehicle surface? And then finally, is there some kind of existing treatment occurring, in whatever fashion?
Thank you. Gabe, do you want to chime in on that?
I think Jeremy pretty much covered it there. So unless whoever asked the question wants to give a little more specifics, I think that's pretty much all we could say. Sure.
No, that's fine. So the bottom line is, and I think Gabe, you made it pretty clear in your discussion that there are examples where it would trigger the 1 acre, but the nature of it wouldn't require any type of recharge requirements or other things. You've actually added a lot of flexibility in there to accommodate, instead of just being a sort of blinders on impervious surface, period, done. You've provided opportunities based on reason and reasonability, where that may or may not actually be necessary. So I think the answer is could be, might be, depending on, like Jeremy said, how the exact details of the site. Joe had asked for some enabling legislation. I think that there's a lot of it there. Thank you very much for that. And I made a comment that, you know, what you're doing is similar to what we do. You know, when you update the rules, it's not a new rule exactly. And yeah, Joe, there is a lot of there are a lot of different pieces of legislation that DEP considers a lot more than we do, but it's still exactly, you know, exactly the same process. Let's see. I think Paul, let's see. Paul had asked a question about, well, actually made a comment. Topsoil layer over sand filters. I haven't seen a lot of that myself, and I think that was in one of the maybe the sand filter detail example, Jeremy, that you showed. And just as a point of clarity, all those details, they were coming from the New Jersey Future Developers Guide. You have a link to it in the chat. And if you don't have that or you can't find that, I can get it to all you guys later. But that's an excellent manual. Graphically, it's beautiful. It is a tremendous resource in terms of the text that explains things in a easy to read, detailed format, and it is downloadable. And I would very much recommend everybody grab a copy of that. It's for developers, but it would be very beneficial for us. Anyhow, as far as that topsoil over the sand filter thing, you see that? Either one of you see much of that, Jeremy or Gabe, in your designs?
Well, I would say, first of all, you don't see that many sand filters to begin. They're one of the least commonly BMPs that I see.
Agreed.
But yeah, our design does allow for a topsoil layer on top of the sand. It is optional, so it's not a requirement. It was also something that was in our infiltration basin chapter for a long time, and for the same reasons that you're mentioning, we took that out in the last one.
Right.
So we don't really want that topsoil on infiltration basins. We haven't really gone in detail and revised our sand filter BMP, partly because we don't see a lot of people using it, so it's not one of our highest priority BMPs to update. But we'll think about that when we do update that one, because I do tend to agree. And also, it's not really providing you with any necessary component to the BMP. I mean, the sand is what provides the treatment.
Right.
Like adding some complication that could result in failure. And why would we want that?
I know I have discouraged its use for the same reason Paul Schreddy mentioned. The topsoil, typically they want to also plant vegetation in there, and you know, it's going to be submerged, and that vegetation tends to die, and then you get a sort of a decomposing biomat there, and then you know, all bets are off. Aside from the fact, Dr. Murphy chimed in that the different type of soil material that it is has a deleterious effect on water movement through it before it gets into the sand layer. So there's a couple of different reasons that I've discouraged it. Jeremy, do you see much of that in your practice in terms of any kind of sand filter one way or the other?
Like Gabe said, I personally have never actually designed a sand filter for a real project in my entire 26 years of doing this. And as far as seeing them, I could probably count on one hand the number of times I've seen them on a set of plans that at least Mazer's done. If we were to do it, I would want to do it more like a bioretention mix. And that's why I had focused on that a little bit when I went through my presentation, that it's not just the organics, it's also the aggregate. You know, you want to make sure it'll pass, you know, the water through. And I would even, you know, kind of argue that you may want to be cognizant of where the BMP is. So, you know, for instance, I'd probably go with, you know, an almost unsurvivable amount of organics in maybe at the bottom of a residential subdivision, because you can have all these lawn areas that are going to be over fertilized. If you're going to get plenty of nutrients coming in the water, but maybe in a parking lot area in a commercial center where, you know, it's a lot more asphalt, not so much, you know, over fertilization, I'd probably have a little bit higher level of organics. But then also, because you're going to get more suspended solids or whatnot, I might have a little bit fewer fines or more coarse material specified in the aggregate side. So, you know, you got to pay some attention. It's like anything, you know, it's not a rubber stamp. You can't just copy and paste details. But I think generally speaking, the right answer is probably to use more of a bioretention mix, not just regular topsoil.
Well, and on top
Sure.
of that, if you start thinking about the designs for our sand filter, it has a requirement for an 18-inch sand layer and a requirement for pre-treatment as well. So what benefit is it offering you to do a sand filter over bioretention when you could do an under-drain bioretention, you could do an infiltration bioretention? Right. There's just nothing you can't achieve with bioretention that you get out of the sand filter that I see.
Exactly.
I agree. I wanted to, just follow up with Jeremy. You mentioned the phosphorus being a potential problem when they create the design mix, the organic mix. We don't review for that. We don't regulate that, but I can see, manure, and I think by manure you meant animal manure. Is that correct? Like horse
Correct.
manure, cow manure, chicken manure. Yep. So yeah, because there is, out there in the world, the green manure or composted vegetation. And I'm assuming when they build the bioretention mix, primarily what they should be using, if they're not exclusively using, is like compost vegetation, like leaves, grass clippings, things like that, that don't have the phosphorus load that comes from animal manure. So we don't regulate that. We could keep an eye on it, when we do our plan review. But that was an interesting, sort of side point that you mentioned. There is, Paul asked a question, just a small question about we've run into occasionally where you have localized scour in the K5 layer in the bottom of a basin when you have your conduit outlet protection. Eventually, it's got to leave the COP. And is there, do you see much issue with that in terms of any kind of degradation to the sand layer that's down there from the local scour? Do you see any? I don't see a huge problem with that. I know sometimes it happens a little bit outside the scour hole or the apron, but it's in the bottom of a basin. It's not going to go very far. Do you have either of you have any thoughts about that?
Well, yeah, I tend to agree with what you're saying. You see some scour occasionally in basins, but if it's designed appropriately, the basin bottom's flat. It's an infiltration basin, so the outlet's raised. So it's really tough for the sand to make its way out of the basin.
There you go.
And generally, it's just limited in scope to an area immediately around the inlet. So you can usually just go in there and replace or maybe rake the material around just to move it back out. So as long as you're getting regular maintenance there, it's really not a problem.
And one additional thing I'll point out, I agree with everything Gabe just said. Under these new rules, the infiltration basin is not going to be the first treatment. It's going to be something in front of it that will attenuate flow, reduce peaks, etc. So that's not to say you can't get a very large storm event that would have some high flows, but I think that the maintenance need will be somewhat reduced because we're going to have these smaller facilities in front of the end of pipe infiltration basin. So it would only be really large storms where you'd have that possibility. Your typical summer afternoon thunderstorm is not going to get a high velocity through the first tier of BMPs. Right.
Thank you. There's a couple other questions here I'll address in a second, but there's something that's just on my mind because it came up in a couple of different ways as you guys were talking, and that is in a nutshell, Gabe mentioned about a deed notice for certain BMPs that may be on a person's property. And I'll give you an example. This happened way back in the day. One of the first times we looked at low impact development on a site in Ocean County was Harmony Estates. And the problem we had was the development was somewhat perched on a level part of the site. And ironically, we always think of Ocean County as Flatville out there, but there are actually some big slopes out there. And in this case, the property line terminated at the break of a really pretty steep slope. And so we got into infiltration and underground infiltration, all kinds of stuff like that. Well, one of the factors in the site design was very limited space for any type of a structure. And so there was a lot of trees out there. And when we modeled the site, when the designer modeled the site, The forested A/B, mostly A soils, was a huge factor in sizing the basin. And we just barely squeezed it in. And we went out, I say we, myself and Hunter Burkhead, when he was working for the department, he and I went out to do a follow-up inspection on the site, and much to our dismay, they had cleared the lots to the property line. So all of the trees, all the forested areas behind, the nominal 20 or 25 foot backyard were taken away to the property line. And we're talking maybe 100, 150 feet back over 50, 60, 70 lots. So in a nutshell, substantially changed the H&H model that the basin was sized on, that the offsite stability system was sized on. So going back to Gabe's point, I'm going to put a deed notice in there. Gabe, are you envisioning that to be for things like that are on lot, such as rain gardens or possibly dry wells and things like that, or might you also include forested areas that are part of somebody's backyard, let's say, like my example, my real world example, that are, to Jeremy's point, a forested BMP of sorts, and would those forested areas behind the property, would they also be, or could they possibly be, on your deed notice? What do you think about that?
Well, in a general sense, I would say no, they're not really planned to be part of the deed notice. It's going to be the BMPs. But if someone is to utilize what Jeremy's mentioning as an actual stormwater BMP, and you're going to direct your stormwater there as a forested bioretention, then yes, that is one of your BMPs and would definitely be part of the deed notice. Now, one thing that you can keep in mind with our clarifications to the definition of major development, right? So if there's a site, break it up into 50 lots and it's a major development, well, it's already a major development. So any disturbance that technically happens out there after that is regulated, because you are now more than 1 acre of disturbance since February 2nd, 2004. So that should be considered. And I know it's difficult. You never know what a property owner is going to do, but you do know the developer to some degree of how much of a lot someone really wants. So if you try to not clear most of the lot, knowing that they're going to clear it later, that I would hope the review agency is going to say, you really have to be realistic about the clearing that's going to happen out here, and let's size this basin a little bit larger so people can have a lot, which is inevitable. But for the most part, I don't really see that. I see most of the lots being mostly cleared already to a reasonable level. So it's usually incorporated, but the review agency could see that, and I think they have the authority to then make someone potentially not clear that area if the basin can't handle it.
Right. Yeah, they had a limit of disturbance on the plan, and they greatly exceeded it. But the penalty for that with us is, well, you got to revise a plan and move your line back. In our case, it was a big concern because the hydrology model was basically gone at this point.
Yeah, well, I would hope the municipality in that case went back to the developer and said, well, you violated the approval that we gave you, so you need to redesign your stormwater management to account for this, or else replant.
Yeah, I actually don't know the outcome of that. But anyhow, that was just an example of something that actually did take place. A couple other comments. Let's see. I'm not sure. It's more of a comment from Joe Dunn. Seasonal high groundwater is also an issue in getting good perk. And I think the groundwater mounding analysis chapter is going to address that. And for those of you who don't know, that goes back a while when DEP commissioned a USGS to do a mounding analysis procedure. I think Sandy Blick was in charge of stormwater at that time. So that's quite a few years ago. So you have some really good quality analysis behind that mounding analysis procedure, and it is relevant. It is necessary because you can have good transmissivity in the soil, but if it's completely saturated anyhow, and you don't have a way to drain that, it really doesn't matter. So anyhow, the point being to speak to that question about saturation is that is part of the enhancement to the BMP manual, taking it another step further than what has already been done in the last couple of years, which has been very good itself. Just let's see, Joe Dunn, disturbance in highlands law call it new improvement, but not necessarily soil exposure. What about contrasting their 1 acre disturbance versus 251 definition? I don't know enough about the highlands laws to speak to that, and also the nuances of their definitions and their language. And I'm not sure if I can really address that. Either one of you want to speak to that? I'm not sure if it's more of a comment than a question.
Well, I didn't realize that their definition of disturbance was different, but I knew their definition of impervious surface was slightly different than ours. I think they counted gravel areas as impervious already. So, yeah, that can be a little complicated, but we just do our best when we review those. Well, first of all, for us, right, we only get highlands permits in pretty rare scenarios because normally there are exemptions from the highlands rules. But so I would suppose that review is then happening at highlands municipalities, and they must have revised their ordinance's definition of major development then to then incorporate this different definition. So it's really the municipality, I would think, that is enforcing that. But again, I'm not super familiar there either.
So I'm going to I'm getting the evil eye from Christine about time, and we've been on for a while. I have one last question, which sort of came up, and I wasn't clear myself for either one of you. With respect to gravel surfaces, Gabe, if somebody's proposing a gravel parking lot, let's say, sometimes you see that with utility installations like power substations. For some reason, they like to use gravel. I'm not sure why. If they create a new gravel surface, and they're going to park on it, move their trucks around on it, is that considered a regulated motor vehicle surface?
Most likely, yes.
Okay, and they would just utilize a curve number that's appropriate for a gravel, in however they design that, right?
Yeah, right. Now, it could be more complicated, I suppose, if they really went for like an open graded stone, because then the curve number, 92 or whatever it is for gravel might not really be applicable.
Right.
Generally, what I see, they usually want to have a surface that's a little more compacted for driving heavy machinery on there. But sometimes they might do that to try and make their basin that they need to put in a little smaller.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That sort of came up in a couple of different my own thoughts, and some things that you had mentioned kind of prompted that. I think, that seems like we've sort of addressed most of the questions that popped up. You've certainly addressed my questions. I don't see any real new questions coming up. I suppose, let me just say to everyone who's still listening, if, what I think is Michael Hill, I can't tell if Mike Hill's hand is being raised or something on his window is flashing. I can't quite see it on my tiny little screen. If we have further questions. Oh, there you go.
It was just a quick question on the developments, and they have all the wonderful green structures going in, but during the winter they plow all the snow into these wonderful green structures, and then it sits there for weeks on end, frozen. What kind of infiltration do we get during those events?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. So first, I would say that
Thank you, Mike.
Following our BMP manual, they shouldn't be plowing the snow into those areas because our BMP manual says specifically that you can't do that. So that's something that the municipality should be looking at as a violation in some way. You can see reduced infiltration rates in frozen soils. There's definitely studies that show that. There's even studies that show that the higher viscosity of near freezing water can limit the infiltration. But fortunately, I think in the winter, we're generally not seeing huge volumes of water. I suppose that could happen where we had a big snowstorm and then suddenly we have a rainstorm thereafter. But that's not that's not one of the most common scenarios of a big rain event in New Jersey anyway. So even if there is some small reduction in as a result of the viscosity, we're probably still okay. The biggest concern would be if the ground's frozen. I think in most of those cases, the snow's not going to melt at that point either. So then there really isn't going to be a big problem. But overall, I think more so plowing the snow into there is going to lead to problems of killing the vegetation. You know, any snow that you're plowing in there usually is not very clean. It's filled with salt and sand and whatever else they lay down. So it's going to negatively impact your BMP in the long run if that's a common practice.
So in other words, it's not a perfect world, is it?
No, it's not.
It is what it is. It's definitely a step up. It could be that, you know, because they're distributed, they might impound or impact a porous pavement area or something, but because it's distributed, you'll have hopefully other areas that will not be impacted. So I really think that's a huge advantage to us. So anyhow, having said that, I don't see real new questions coming up, and I think we've kind of whipped this horse to death. Guys, I want to thank you both. I know you've done this. You've done it so well. You could kind of take this on the road, really, as an act. Always, I learn something new every time I hear you to give the presentations, and I really appreciate giving us your time this afternoon. Christine, is there any other issues that we need to do or take care of?
No, I just want to say thank you to Jeremy and Gabe and you as well, John. And we did record this for your viewing pleasure at a later date. Hopefully, we will be able to post it on the New Jersey Association of Conservation District website. And you can feel free to email me directly if you have specific questions that you did not get answered, and I will direct them to the proper expert to assist. So I really appreciate it. We had 52 people on at the peak. They're falling off now. So thank you, everybody, and have a good afternoon.
All right. Thank you very much, Ocean County, for hosting this for us. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Gentlemen, we'll see you around.
All right. Take care, everyone.
All right.
Take care. Bye.
Again. Bye-bye now.
Yep.
Bye. Bye, Christine. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
John.
We'll see you soon.
We can stop recording.